As we have looked at in earlier episodes, the Republic of China established itself in Taiwan from 1949, having lost the Chinese Civil War on the mainland. Chiang Kai-shek, supported by the United States and the West, represented a free China, which only goes to say a non-communist China. Kuomintang rule in Taiwan was far from democratic, and the party exercised control of the island using a heavy hand, including a mix of violence, imprisonment, surveillance, discrimination, and indoctrination. Civil and political liberties were restricted, and estimates of those executed range into the tens of thousands. I'm your host David, and this week we are exploring the period in Taiwan's history which started even before the KMT's loss to Mao, commonly known as the White Terror. This is the Cold War. When we look at topics as events of the past, of history, those events often impact the present, and today's topic is a primary example of that, which is why I need to recommend an outstanding video I watched recently on Magellan TV, China vs. USA, Empires at War. The video looks at the relationship between the two superpowers and their struggle over Taiwan. The video looks at how the issues of trade and politics, technology, and military affairs might be resolved. And one of the best things about the video, it is completely ad-free, just like every video on Magellan TV, including the new 4K content that is being added every week. And Cold War viewers will get a 1-month free trial by clicking on the link in the description. Make sure to start your free trial of Magellan TV so you can join us in watching China vs. USA, Empires at War. Nationalist rule was established in Taiwan on October 25, 1945, following the Japanese surrender. The Taiwanese people, who had by that time endured 50 years of Japanese colonial rule, met Kuomintang forces with jubilation, seeing them as liberators. It didn't take long, however, for that enthusiasm to wear off. Nationalist rule was inefficient when compared with the Japanese, and most government attention was directed towards the mainland and the struggle against Mao. The Taiwanese perceived their new overlords on the mainland as corrupt, inexperienced, and ignorant. Social services deteriorated, most notably healthcare, and the island's resources were extensively exploited in order to help support the war effort on the mainland. The cost of rice increased, and as it did, the Taiwanese people became frustrated with the mainlanders, who were being awarded higher positions in government along with better salaries. In combination, this made Taiwan a powder keg ready to explode. And explode it did. On the evening of February 27, 1947, a relatively minor event in Taipei spiraled into a major one. Officers of the Monopoly Bureau found an old woman illegally selling cigarettes. They attempted to arrest the woman, but a crowd gathered. In the following confusion, an officer shot and killed one of the people in the crowd that had formed. That crowd erupted in outrage, and although they failed to catch the fleeing officers, they did march to a local police station demanding justice. The Propaganda Commission ordered newspapers to not publish anything about the event in the hope of keeping things quiet. But the next day, on February 28, hence the name of the incident, 228, Taiwan rose up in revolt. Protesters occupied a radio station and spread information about the events, as well as calling for violent action against mainlanders. They also called for people to gather in Taipei's New Park in order to march on the provincial administration office. The few terrified policemen left to defend the administration, to absolutely no one's surprise, fired into the crowd, killing 2 and further escalating the situation. Violence against mainlanders spread across the island, with the Taiwanese demanding that strangers speak either Japanese or one of the Taiwanese languages, Hokkien or Hakka. Those who failed to respond correctly ran the risk of being beaten, sometimes even to death. More than 1,000 mainlanders were killed, with many of them being caught completely unaware. The violence, which had broken out organically and as a result was quite disorganized, soon calmed down as a resolution committee was established in Taipei in order to maintain safety and order. The committee started to make demands to the local governor. Gradually, though, as nationalist control over the island weakened, the committee's demands became more harsh and more uncompromising. For the Kuomintang, a rebellion in Taiwan was untimely, to say the least. The situation on the mainland in March of 1947 had looked promising. The nationalists had seized Yan'an, and Chiang Kai-shek was making optimistic estimates that the communists would be defeated by that autumn. The Generalissimo's army, which had spent the past 2 decades fighting and dying in wars against the communists and the Japanese, now had to quickly put down an allegedly communist rebellion by some former Japanese subjects who didn't even speak proper Mandarin. This was a recipe for disaster. KMT troops being deployed to the island started shooting even before they reached the shore. In urban areas, they shot indiscriminately at anyone who happened to be on the street. This was seen as standard practice for Kuomintang forces on the mainland, but was unexpected on Taiwan. The worst of the violence lasted from March 12th to May 15th, and the number of casualties is unclear, with a figure of between 20,000 and 30,000 being an accepted figure in modern Taiwan. Now, as with any recent historical instance of what amounts to mass murder, 228 has no shortage of politically biased and ideologically driven interpretations. I'm sure we'll see more than a few in the comments section. The Chinese Communist Party linked the incident to pro-communist uprisings on the mainland, claiming that the Taiwanese people found their inspiration in Chairman Mao. This narrative is to some extent supported by a socialist writer, Chen Ying-chen, one of the few people to write about the White Terror during the White Terror itself. He claimed that the victims of the Kuomintang were socialists, who fought for the Taiwanese working class and hoped for communist success on the mainland. In modern Taiwan, there are 2 interpretations which dominate discourse, linked, unsurprisingly, to the 2 main political forces on the island. The Pan-Blue coalition, which includes the KMT, shifts the blame onto corrupt local officials, most notably the governor Chen Yi, who was executed as a traitor in 1950. The Pan-Green coalition frames 228 as an ethnic conflict and an episode in the struggle for Taiwanese independence. The interpretation most important to the actual sequence of events, however, is the one made by the Kuomintang immediately after the revolt. In a report to Chiang Kai-shek made in March 1947, it concluded that the Taiwanese people were deceived by communist organizers and easily misled due to their evil education from the Japanese. This interpretation is what was used to justify the extreme violence, repressive legislation, and the policies of the White Terror in general. Now, speaking of repressive legislation, martial law was then introduced on the island, remaining in place for 40 years until 1987. 2 more pieces of legislation are also worth mentioning here: the Rebellion Act of 1949 and the Banditry Act of 1950. Individuals who broke sedition laws were subject to the death penalty, and civilians could be arrested and sentenced to death if they were suspected of intentional or even potential participation in a revolt. Collective punishment was introduced, with suspects' families, colleagues, and even acquaintances being put under the threat of punishment. Under the 2 acts, at least 3,000 civilians were executed and 8,000 imprisoned between 1950 to 1954. An example of a Kuomintang punitive action can be seen in the village of Luku. In early 1953, 10,000 soldiers surrounded the village, allegedly an armed base for communists. In the village of Luku, they found a single pistol, 165 homemade bombs, 7 mines, 5 PRC flags, 10 Red Army armbands, 2 banners of the Taiwan People's Militia, and 43 maps. For this, 183 villagers were arrested, 3/4 of them being poor, illiterate coal miners. 36 of the 183 people were executed, and a further 97 of them were imprisoned for a total of 871 years. But the use of collective punishments like this had a certain logic, no matter how twisted. The Banditry Act required civilians who had information about so-called bandit spies to report that information to the local police or public security officials, and a failure to do so could be reason for arrest. Political dissidents and their families were socially alienated, since making contact with a potential suspect could trigger some unpleasant talks with security agents. At the same time, strangers, acquaintances, and even otherwise trusted people could act as government informants in order to avoid arrest. Thus, for the common people, the safest behavioral strategy was to become politically apathetic. None of these strategies and tactics are new or unique to Taiwan, we should point out, and they are common features of security states throughout history and around the world. So, the task of identifying suspects was assigned to the Garrison Command, an affiliate of the National Security Council, and they essentially acted as a secret police force. This organization was extra-constitutional and was primarily used to prevent islanders from attempting to challenge the political order and then to socially exclude from society any individuals who tried. The exclusion meant prison, by the way. A minimum term for those who acted against the government was set at 7 years, while those who merely prepared or conspired to do so could get from 6 months to 5 years. Ringleaders, on the other hand, were imprisoned for life. The most infamous prison was located on Green Island, about 30 kilometers off Taiwan's southeastern coast. There, inmates were subjected to, among other things, psychological therapies, re-education, and were forced to compose letters confessing their crimes. Behaving like a Kuomintang supporter, however, one who had realized and then mended the error of their old ways, could result in an earlier release date, or at least could help avoid bodily harm. The real effectiveness of all these methods towards creating genuine sympathy for the Kuomintang was, of course, questionable. Of course, methods of indoctrination were not just limited to prisons. By 1958, the Kuomintang had established 28 newspapers and 498 journals and magazines. Schools were used extensively to promote Kuomintang ideology and its vision for Taiwan, which you will recall was that the island is merely one of China's provinces, one which just happens to host the national government, a temporary situation until nationalist control over the mainland is restored. Although the China's rightful government part of the formula is quite well known, for today's topic, it's more relevant to look at the part which claims that Taiwan should be Chinese as opposed to Taiwanese. During the White Terror, Chinese teachers and school administrators from the mainland were assigned to Taiwan's public schools, leaving the Taiwanese as secondary assistants. The usual school routine included daily flag-raising ceremonies, military training courses, and music lessons on military anthems. Children were taught songs such as Fight Our Way Back to the Mainland, I Am Chinese, China Will Be Strong, I Love China, and The Plum Blossom, with rewards for the kids who memorized and sang them better than others. New Kuomintang-approved books were published and replaced the older Japanese and Taiwanese ones. In these books, Chinese identity, history, and culture were celebrated, with little to no attention being given to the Taiwanese identity, history, and culture. The language of learning was strictly Mandarin, with language police operating in schools. Individuals found speaking Taiwanese were fined. If students were caught, they had to wear signs around their necks saying, "I spoke Taiwanese." Thus, among younger people, an attitude was created that speaking Taiwanese rather than Mandarin was something to be ashamed of. As a result, proficiency in Taiwanese languages, such as Hokkien and Hakka, have deteriorated, and several of Taiwan's indigenous languages have come close to extinction. Proficiency in Mandarin, on the other hand, has improved significantly. And it's not like the dominating presence of mainland Chinese culture, language, and traditions was present only in schools. Following the Kuomintang exodus to Taiwan, land reform was launched, which had two important side effects. One of them was through land redistribution, breaking the power that the Taiwanese landlords had over local communities. The other was providing land to 2 million mainlanders all around Taiwan, and having them establish households in Taiwanese populated areas. In some cases, military villages were created to house soldiers and their families. Mainlander soldiers frequently married local women, and according to statements from at least one such woman, the rule of the house was never to cook Taiwanese dishes and to have children only learn to speak Mandarin. Mainlanders also had more career opportunities than the Taiwanese, which led to the latter focusing their studies on science and medicine rather than social sciences and law. So remember how a minute ago I said the KMT's official viewpoint was that Taiwan was just another province of China? Well, under a newly established examination system, students, both from Taiwanese and mainlander families, were evenly distributed to high schools and universities based on their provincial origin. The Taiwanese, being from merely one of China's 35 provinces, received 1/35 of the spots. In order to create a new Chinese-centric identity on the island, the Kuomintang banned public performances of Taiwanese songs, music, and theater. Taiwanese opera, which had been very popular among the indigenous population, was prohibited and replaced instead with Peking opera, Chiang Kai-shek's favorite. When TV was introduced to the island, programs were run strictly in Mandarin. Radio stations broadcasting in Hokkien, although they had operated initially, disappeared after 1962. Even performances of Japanese songs were banned. These restrictions on the use of so-called dialects were in force until 1987. Mandarin does remain the Republic of China's official language, with several generations of islanders born during the White Terror being more fluent in Mandarin than in their native tongues. However, since the 1990s, Taiwanese languages have made a rebound, with increasing numbers of younger people using Hokkien or Hakka. In 1987, President Chiang Ching-kuo, the son of Chiang Kai-shek, announced the end of military rule and ended martial law shortly before his own death. His successor, Taiwanese-born Lee Teng-hui, appealed to the islanders to forget the past and to look forward. In a new era of democratic accountability, many did the opposite, however, collecting information about the victims of the White Terror and demanding justice, the release of secret files, an official apology, financial compensation, and appropriate memorials to the persecuted. The opposition Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, was particularly active in opening discussion about the White Terror. An effort was made to increase awareness of Kuomintang atrocities among younger generations, which were largely unaware of them. In 1989, a movie was released called A City of Sadness, recounting the events of 228. The movie was extremely popular and has been described as the Taiwanese cultural event of its time. Throughout the late 1980s and 90s, Taiwan went through a decade of investigations. With the increased recognition of human loss and suffering, legislators held a silent tribute to the victims of the White Terror. In 1995, President Lee formally apologized for 228. The Legislative Yuan passed a bill providing compensation for those wrongly imprisoned or executed during the period of martial law. The emphasis is on wrongly, as people who were actually involved in insurgent violence were not to be compensated. A redress of up to 6 million Taiwanese dollars could be of tremendous help against the financial burdens for victims and their families. As a result, the political dissidents of the past were rather cautious and selective about which stories they would share with the public. Official testimonies are, as a result, skewed to show a general picture of innocent, non-violent victimhood. In total, 6,022 cases of compensation were approved, including 699 for executions and 53 for sentences of life imprisonment. Between 1989 and 2002, 20 memorials were erected at execution sites around the island, including the village of Luku. A museum dedicated to 228 was opened in Taipei. February 28 was declared a national holiday. Taipei New Park was renamed 228 Peace Park. On the 50th anniversary of the massacre, Vice President Lian Chan addressed it as a historical mistake, indicating that Taiwan should tender the truth unto history, clear the victims of their unjust charges, clarify misunderstandings, and wipe out the hidden concern for ethnic tension. Upon coming to power, the DPP was quick to remove statues of Chiang Kai-shek from both public and military institutions. The memory of the White Terror, however, remains contested. It's a subject of political mythologization, with rival political forces pushing their own narratives of the events. In 2007, an Academia Sinica scholar, Chu Hongyuan, praised the military intervention of 1947, justifying the extensive violence. As recently as 2014, the Kuomintang-controlled Ministry of Education was criticized for replacing the term White Terror in the curriculum with abuse of government power. To quote the Secretary General of the Taiwan Association for the Care of the Victims of Political Persecution during the martial law period, the change, quote, is not only doing too little for transitional justice, it is also obliterating history, end quote. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and make sure to like and subscribe and press the bell button. Just make sure you don't suppress, oppress, impress, or any other sort of press while you do it. Please also consider supporting us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.